October 14th, 1943, 9:30 a.m. Over the flat gray fields of northern France, the men of the 8th Air Force knew they were already doomed. The formation, comprising nearly 350 B-117 flying fortresses, was aimed deep into Bavaria, targeting the critical ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. This mission was a calculated gamble, one the planners felt they had to take, but one the crews understood was suicidal. They had flown past the operational limit of their short-range P-47 Thunderbolt escorts an hour earlier. Now they were alone. The concept of the bomber stream relied on mutual defensive fire, the idea that massed 50-caliber machine guns could deter any attacker. But the Luftwaffe, cunning and ruthless in their own airspace, had learned the tactical weaknesses of the American box formation. They didn't engage head-on. They waited, sometimes assembling up to 50 fighters in a single devastating pass. For the young American pilots and gunners, the vulnerability felt physical, like having one's armor stripped away molecule by molecule. They watched the German twin-engine Me-1110s and Ju-88 circle just outside the defensive envelope, waiting for the single-engine Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs to slash through the formation, splitting groups and leaving cripples for the heavy cannon fire of the Zerstörers. The losses that day were catastrophic, ultimately earning the mission the grim moniker Black Thursday. 60 bombers failed to return. An additional 138 were damaged severely. Nearly 600 airmen were lost, killed, or captured. It was a statistical impossibility to sustain such casualty rates. The air campaign against Germany was grinding to a halt, choked by the distance between Allied airfields and Reich targets. In Berlin, Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering watched the reports roll in with a sense of satisfied, almost theatrical smugness. He had always dismissed the American daylight bombing efforts as an amateurish vanity project. Goering understood geography and aviation limitations perfectly. He knew that the only fighter capable of truly escorting a bomber force all the way to targets like Schweinfurt or deeper into the Ruhr Valley was the bomber itself, and that proposition was proving fatally flawed. Goering's confidence was rooted in the unshakable strategic advantage held by the Diefer. The German fighter pilots were fighting over their home soil. If they were damaged, they could glide to friendly territory and fight another day. If an Allied bomber was damaged, it became a coffin in the sky, 3 miles up and 600 miles from home. The Reichsmarschall publicly scoffed at the capabilities of the American fighter technology. He had received reports about the P-38 Lightnings, which were fast but suffered from mechanical issues at extreme ranges, and the P-47 Thunderbolts, which were robust, close-in escorts, but consumed fuel too quickly to make the round trip to key strategic targets. He told his staff that the Americans were simply incapable of manufacturing a fighter with the necessary urance. His mockery was venomous and dismissive. He boasted that no 4-engine bomber could be successfully protected deep inside the Reich. The daylight offensive was doomed to failure, and the Luftwaffe's strategy was simple: let the American bombers chew through their fuel and their protection, and then deploy the entire might of the Reich's air defenses at the crucial moment of vulnerability, often just past the German border. This period of late 1943 represented the existential low point for the combined bomber offensive. The American High Command, led by General Karl Spaatz, faced an agonizing decision. They had to hit the targets essential to paralyze Hitler's war machine oil refineries, aircraft factories, and ball-bearing plants, but they were sacrificing entire bomber groups to do so. They knew they had only 2 options left: abandon daylight precision bombing entirely and revert to ineffective night area bombing, or somehow, miraculously, find a way to conquer the great distance. For months, the Luftwaffe operated with near impunity against the unescorted heavies. Their pilots became the true aces of the war, racking up incredible kill totals against the slow, predictable targets. They did not fear the American fighter pilots because they rarely saw them in the deep, dangerous airspace above Germany. The skies, as far as Goering was concerned, were still safely and definitively theirs. It was a tactical security guaranteed by physics, fuel, and the inherent distance of the war. But Goering's arrogance blinded him to the relentless urgency driving the American innovation. While the Reichsmarschall was busy congratulating himself on the slaughter over Schweinfurt, the engineers and planners across the Atlantic were engaged in a desperate race. They needed a technical savior, a fighter plane that did not yet exist in sufficient numbers or with the required modifications, a plane that would utterly negate the strategic advantage of distance and finally bring the air war directly to the German factory floor. Escorted by a guardian capable of staying the course, the specifications were demanding range, speed, and enough flexibility to adapt to the deep penetration mission. The answer was already flying, but it had not yet been given its wings for the journey into the hostile German heartland. That vehicle was the North American P-51, but before it could be deployed in its definitive long-range configuration, a host of political and engineering hurdles had to be cleared. While Allied planners wrestled with fuel capacity and high-altitude performance, the man who stood as the absolute gatekeeper of German airspace remained profoundly insulated by layers of self-deception and unprecedented power. Hermann Wilhelm Goering was more than just the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe. He was the Reichsmarschall, a title unique to him, heavy with opulence, and the second most powerful man in the entire hierarchy of the Third Reich. His primary residence, Caron Hall deep within the Schorfheide forest, was less a home and more a personal museum and monarch's court, a repository for countless pieces of stolen art, massive banqueting halls, and grotesque custom-designed uniforms, meticulously crafted to inflate his ever-growing persona. Goering's ego was as vast as the territory Hitler claimed, fueled by the early, stunning victories of the Blitzkrieg, for which he demanded and received lavish credit. This early success fostered an absolute conviction that his judgment was infallible, a quality that proved ultimately fatal once the air war shifted from short, tactical raids to the grinding strategic attrition initiated by the Western Allies. The Reichsmarschall dismissed the growing American air formations with contemptuous ease, certain that their equipment, their pilots, and their sheer logistics could never match the skill and tenacity of his own forces. He publicly scoffed at the deep penetration capability of the B-17 and B-24 fleets, confident that the mighty belts of German flak batteries and the interceptor wings of the day fighters could annihilate anything the enemy threw at them long before the vulnerable industrial targets could be struck. His most famous and most damning promise, made in 1939 during the Polish campaign, was that if even a single enemy bomb ever fell on the Ruhr Valley, he would change his name to Meyer, a common Jewish surname meant to denote total disgrace. Yet by late 1943, the Ruhr was already a smoking ruin, a constant, glowing beacon for Allied navigators. His original name remained, and Goering had simply retreated further into the convenient delusion that American industrial capacity and long-range aviation development were nothing more than exaggerated propaganda. This organizational blindness was the crucial flaw. His strategic failures stemmed not merely from lack of resources. At times the Luftwaffe possessed ample, but from an inflexible refusal to delegate command effectively or tolerate any criticism that contradicted his own often fanciful strategic designs. He saw the American air offensive not as a coordinated military effort, but as a series of expensive, amateurish spasms easily repelled by the German defensive genius. He believed the American pilots lacked the fortitude for sustained, bloody combat, and that their escort fighters currently operating mostly over occupied France and the Low Countries were too timid and too short-legged to truly challenge the sanctity of German airspace. He was assured by his technical staff that the logistical demands of a true, deep escort mission were utterly impossible to overcome. The Reichsmarschall, draped in ridiculous metals and fine silks, sat atop a vast, powerful military machine, mocking the distant, slow-moving Allied threat while dismissing the very weapon being forged to destroy his authority and expose his great lie. What Goering consistently failed to understand was that the Americans viewed the air war not merely as a localized defense mechanism, but as an extension of their colossal, optimized industrial power. They were not trying to match German output. They were building an overwhelming surplus designed to flood the skies and absorb losses that would be catastrophic for the finite resources of the Reich. And that final, necessary piece of the puzzle The long-range Escort was already being mass-produced, adapting rapidly to solve the very problems Goering deemed insurmountable. The Mustang was, after all, originally powered by an American Allison engine, but the British, recognizing its superb aerodynamic qualities, had suggested a critical, transformative change. November 29, 1942, 11 a.m. In the packed briefing hall of the Reich Aviation Ministry in Berlin, the change suggested was replacing the Allison with the Legery Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. This was a stroke of genius, or perhaps simply the recognition of an immutable truth. Good aerodynamics require superb power at altitude to truly excel. The American Packard Motor Car Company was tasked with producing the Merlin under license, refining it for mass production, and integrating it into the Slur Mustang airframe. This merged the superb stability and range of the American design with the raw, high-altitude power of British engineering. The resulting aircraft, the P-51B and P-51C models, were not merely improvements, they were game-changers possessing the speed to challenge German interceptors and the internal fuel capacity, supplemented by enormous drop tanks, to fly the entire distance to the deepest Reich targets and return home safely. Yet, as 1943 dawned and the Allies prepared this new weapon for deployment, Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering remained insulated by hubris and poor intelligence. His confidence was rooted not only in the perceived strength of the Luftwaffe, but in the undeniable protection afforded by simple geography. American bombing strategy still developing relied primarily on short-range fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt, which could only escort the bombers deep into German territory before turning back, leaving the heavy bombers exposed over the central and eastern portions of the country. This gap, the bomber's vulnerable hour, was the heart of Goering's defensive strategy. He was convinced the psychological strain of unescorted daylight raids would force the Americans to desist, or at least shift permanently to night operations like the British, thereby sacrificing the supposed accuracy of daylight bombing. Goering loved the spotlight and understood the power of public decree, particularly when aimed at calming a nervous civilian population exposed nightly to British raids. He stood repeatedly before his subordinates and the press, a monument of self-satisfaction in his elaborate white uniform, and guaranteed the safety of the German heartland. He used phrases that, in retrospect, sealed his reputation as a laughingstock. His guarantee was ironclad, unreserved, and frequently repeated, "No enemy bomber will ever reach the Ruhr." The Ruhr Valley was critical, the industrial engine of the war machine, but his true, spectacular boast focused on the German capital itself. In the early autumn of 1943, when the weight of the American 8th Air Force was finally being felt deeper into northern Germany, but before the P-51 had truly joined the fight, Goering offered his most infamous promise. He proclaimed that if a single enemy aircraft was spotted over Berlin, the German people could legitimately call him by the common, contemptuous Jewish surname. He told the assembled party officials and air staff, perhaps in a fit of rhetorical overreach, that if the enemy ever succeeded in bombing the capital, they could call him Meyer. The effect was immediate and psychologically calming for his audience. The guarantee was taken as absolute truth, a binding agreement delivered by the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe himself. This declaration was widely publicized and became the cornerstone of civil defense assurance throughout the Reich. Goering's confidence was infectious among the senior political ranks, but beneath the bluster, the fighter pilots of the Luftwaffe knew the situation was deteriorating. They had already faced the devastating firepower of the American heavy bomber formations, particularly the B-17 Flying Fortress, which proved far tougher and better defended than German intelligence reports indicated. The interceptor pilots could only attack the bombers successfully if they sacrificed their own fuel reserves and altitude to battle the protective fighter screen on the edges of the Reich. They realized that if the enemy's escort range extended just 200 more miles, the entire defensive calculus would shatter. The Luftwaffe was still reliant on twin-engine heavy fighters like the Me-1110 and single-engine, short-range interceptors like the Bf-119 and the Fu-190. While superb combat machines, they were optimized for short, lethal bursts of fighting, not for prolonged escort duties. Crucially, The air staff focused on improving the rate of bomber destruction by equipping aircraft with heavier cannons, unguided rockets, and focusing on specialized bomber-destroyer units. They failed to recognize that the true threat was not the lethality of the American bomber, but the logistics of the American fighter. They viewed the fighter as a nuisance to be swatted away near the front, not as a permanent threat that would fly with the bombers all the way to target and back. This fixation on the bomber itself, rather than on eliminating the means of its defense, cost the Luftwaffe dearly. The Allied forces, meanwhile, had begun the coordinated deployment of the long-range P-51 Mustang into the strategic mix. By late 1943, the Merlin-powered Mustangs began appearing in small numbers, initially assigned to defensive patrols and local escort duties. The true test of the Mustang's capability, however, was reserved for early 1944. General Carl Spaatz, commander of USS Strategic Air Forces in Europe, and General James Doolittle, now leading the 8th Air Force, understood that they must execute a strategy that would force the Luftwaffe into a decisive terminal battle. This strategic plan was given a chillingly professional code name, Operation Argument. Operation Argument was scheduled for February 1944, a sustained, week-long assault aimed directly at the heart of the German aircraft industry fighter assembly plants and engine factories, with the explicit goal of drawing the Luftwaffe out into open combat and destroying them in the air. The mission was not simply to destroy factories, but to achieve air superiority over Europe by destroying the enemy's capacity to replace lost pilots and aircraft. This was the moment the long-range escort would prove its worth, penetrating deeper than ever before. Goering's defensive line, stretched thin and exhausted from months of grueling combat over the industrial areas, was about to snap. The German defers were entirely unprepared for the depth of penetration the Allied escort would achieve. They had mentally compartmentalized the air war. The British came at night and the Americans came by day, but both retreated once the daylight escort limit was reached. Goering's operational staff, steeped in the delusion that the Americans could not sustain the losses incurred during the brief unescorted phases, failed to adequately track the Mustang's capabilities or deployment. Their greatest weakness was their inability to believe that American manufacturing could produce, test, modify, and deploy a completely new class of fighter aircraft in such a short time. The first major raids of Operation Argument, dubbed Big Week by the crews, saw massive formations of B-17s and B-24s pushed far into the Reich. The Luftwaffe reacted with ferocious energy, attempting to employ their massed interceptors against the unescorted segments of the bomber stream, only to find the P-51s suddenly refusing to turn back. The German pilots, trained to break formation only after the escort fighters departed, now found themselves entering a lethal zone that extended hundreds of miles deeper than they had ever experienced. The Mustang pilots, equipped with superior high-altitude performance and the mission mandate to hunt the enemy aggressively, were not merely escorting the bombers, they were seeking out and destroying German fighters wherever they could be found. The shift was instantaneous and catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. German pilots who survived the initial onslaught reported sighting single-engine fighters with sleek lines and distinctive shark-nosed radiators flying over Kassel and Leipzig, areas previously considered safe zones. The range capability was terrifyingly clear. The P-51 was destroying the Reich's geographical advantage. And then, inevitably, came the target Goering had guaranteed would remain inviolate. The long-range fighter was finally within striking distance of the capital. March 6, 1944, over the northwestern outskirts of Berlin, the air raid sirens wailed a note of genuine panic the capital had not experienced before. This was not the sporadic night visitation of the RAF, but the disciplined, crushing blow of the American 8th Air Force, striking in the harsh light of midday. The sky was thick with contrails, and for the first time, Luftwaffe pilots climbing toward the bomber stream saw dozens of high-altitude silver aircraft waiting for them, circling with an unnerving confidence. The flying fortresses were here, and their little frees were here to stay. The attack on Berlin confirmed Goering's most profound failure. Yet the crisis that necessitated this desperate, deep penetration strategy, the crisis the Mustang was designed to solve, had already cost the 8th Air Force dearly. Long before the P-51 fully mastered the skies over the Reich, The Americans had been forced to repeatedly throw their unescorted heavy bombers into the heart of German airspace, resulting in some of the most catastrophic losses of the air war. The strategic planners in England knew that to truly cripple the Reich, they had to destroy the sources of its industrial power, particularly the ball-bearing plants. These tiny components were the lifeblood of every tank, gun, and aircraft engine, and 60% of Germany's output came from two cities, Schweinfurt and Regensburg. The initial raids had been devastating, but the German response, learning from every previous attack, was becoming terrifyingly effective. The lowest point came on a cold October day in 1943. This mission would forever be known in the annals of the 8th Air Force simply as Black Thursday. October 14, 1943, saw the second major attempt to neutralize Schweinfurt. The bombers launched into the dawn, their route taking them far beyond the protective umbrella of their short-range fighters. The Luftwaffe was waiting. It did not merely respond to the raid, it executed a meticulously planned interception designed for total destruction. Over Aachen, the first wave of German fighters, twin-engine Messerschmitt Bff-10Ns and Junkers Ju-88s, tore into the formation, their heavy cannon fire ripping massive holes in the B-17s. These initial attackers were focused purely on disruption, scattering the tight defensive box formations and separating vulnerable individual aircraft. Then came the single-engine fighters, the Focke-Wulf W-190s, and the agile Messerschmitt Bf-109s. They attacked in disciplined, relentless relays, coordinated by ground controllers who knew precisely where the American formations were headed. Unlike earlier battles, the German pilots were conserving ammunition, flying directly through the defensive fire and focusing their attacks on vulnerable areas, cockpits, wings, routes, and fuel tanks, often attacking from the front, a position where the American bombers had weak defensive fire. The sheer duration of the engagement was unimaginable. For 3 solid hours, from the time they crossed the Rhine until they neared the target, the air crews fought a running battle against an enemy who outnumbered them and held the tactical advantage of home territory. They flew through skies filled with wreckage, burning oil, and the parachutes of their dying comrades. The pilots, flying straight and level into the flak-filled target zone, could do nothing but absorb the punishment. When the surviving B-17s finally limped back across the English Channel, the tally was a horrifying indictment of the deep penetration strategy. 60 B-17 flying fortresses were shot down over enemy territory. 5 more crashed on landing, damaged beyond repair. Of the 291 bombers that had set out, 77 were total losses, and nearly 140 others were damaged. Of the roughly 3,000 men who flew that mission, 650 were killed or captured. The 8th Air Force was effectively grounded for months following Black Thursday. The operational losses were unsustainable. Generals like Curtis LeMay argued that daylight precision bombing was impossible without achieving air superiority first. The German defense had proven that their coordinated fighter power, stationed at interior airfields, could annihilate any unescorted force, no matter how heavily armored the bombers were. This catastrophic failure forced a profound and urgent strategic shift. The primary objective was no longer ball bearings or factories, but the German Air Force itself. The United States Army Air Force had to destroy the fighters before they could destroy the bombers. This imperative gave the P-51 Mustang, with its newfound range, its true mission to hunt down and kill every German fighter it could find, deep within the Reich, and clear the path for the vulnerable heavy bombers. Goering might have mocked the early Allied fighters, but the sight of the P-51 over Berlin meant the war was no longer about defeating industrial complexes, it was about the survival of the Luftwaffe itself, and Hermann Goering was ill-prepared for this final desperate fight. January 29, 1945, 2 p.m. at Carenhall, the country estate of Reichsmarschall Hermann Goering. The long-awaited deep penetration strikes into the Reich, the centerpiece of the American daylight bombing strategy, were predicated on exactly that, deep penetration. But throughout 1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force fought a brutal, losing battle against simple physics and the cruel reality of aeronautical engineering. The two fighters intended to shepherd the vulnerable heavy bombers. The P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning were magnificent machines, yet they suffered from a fatal flaw. They were tied to an invisible, restrictive leash. The P-47 Thunderbolt, nicknamed the Jug, was a magnificent brute of a machine. It could soak up incredible punishment, delivering devastating salvos from its 8 50 caliber machine guns. American pilots loved its robustness, but German pilots quickly learned its limitations. The Jug was heavy, powered by a massive, powerful radial engine, an engine that was notoriously thirsty. Even utilizing external drop tanks, the effective combat radius of the early P-47 models rarely exceeded 200 miles from their English airfields. This radius encompassed the coastline, the immediate targets in the Low Countries, and maybe the western edges of the Ruhr Valley. But the critical strategic targets, the ball-bearing factories, the aircraft assembly plants, and the synthetic fuel refineries, lay far deeper within the dark heart of Germany. Then there was the twin-boomed P-38 Lightning. Designed originally for long-distance patrolling in the Pacific, it held the theoretical range advantage that the P-47 lacked. However, the high-altitude, cold conditions over Central Europe proved unkind to the early Lightning models. Operational issues, from engine failures exacerbated by the cold to catastrophic cabin heating problems, meant the P-38 rarely achieved its design promise in the critical missions over Germany. While it could stretch its legs further than the Jug, the Lightning still could not consistently and reliably offer continuous protection to the bomber stream all the way to Berlin or even major targets further east like Leipzig or Poznan. The outcome was a brutal operational reality, known bitterly by the bomber crews as the separation. The B-17, Flying Fortresses, and B-24 Liberators would fly their precise, tight formations, escorted by every P-47 and P-38 the 8th Air Force could muster. But at a predetermined point, usually coinciding with the fighters' fuel reserves hitting critical mass for the return trip, the escorts would dip their wings, turn, and signal their departure. This point of no return was not secret. German fighter control, the Jagdfliegerführer, knew precisely where the line was drawn, and they waited, gathering their formations just beyond the reach of the Thunderbolts and Lightnings. For the next hour and a half, or sometimes 2, the skies belonged entirely to the German Jagdgeschwader. The ensuing slaughter was devastating. Missions like the raid on Schweinfurt in August and October of 1943, known as Black Thursday, proved catastrophically expensive. The heavy, unescorted bombers were helpless against the coordinated attacks of cannon-equipped German interceptors. The 8th Air Force was losing men and machines at an unsustainable rate, proving beyond doubt that the entire strategic bombing campaign was impossible, until a fighter emerged that possessed 2 things: the speed and firepower of the P-47, and the range to fly all the way to the deepest targets and back again. The war against German industry could not be won by the bombers alone. It required a true, long-legged guardian, and that guardian had not yet fully arrived in the European theater. June 1940, Inglewood, California. The British Purchasing Commission arrived at the North American Aviation Factory with a simple request: license, build the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk to bolster the dwindling RAF fighter inventory. James Kindleberger, the head of North American Aviation, was not interested in producing another company's design, especially one he already considered mediocre. Instead, he made an audacious counterproposal, telling the British delegation that his company could design and produce a completely new, vastly superior fighter aircraft in less time than it would take to set up the P-40 production line. Operating under the extreme urgency of the Blitz, the British took the monumental gamble, commissioning a prototype fighter with a deadline of 120 days. The result was the NA-73X, a machine that displayed a sleek, revolutionary airframe, particularly its innovative laminar flow wing designed for speed and efficiency. The initial production models, designated the Mustang Mark I by the RAF, were fast and possessed unparalleled range thanks to the clean aerodynamic design. They were powered by the American Allison V1710 engine. Yet while the first Mustangs excelled at low-altitude reconnaissance and ground attack missions, they quickly revealed a fatal flaw for high-altitude escort duties. The Allison engine, fitted with a single-stage supercharger, began to suffocate severely above 15,000 feet. It lost the power and acceleration needed to engage the specialized German interceptors that were attacking the bomber formations at 25,000 feet and higher. The Mustang was a reliable runner, but it was asthmatic when required to sprint at altitude. It had the legs to reach the targets, but lacked the necessary breath to fight once it arrived. Across the Atlantic, in the Rolls-Royce factory in Derby, England, engineers had been closely monitoring the performance of the American airframe. They recognized the inherent genius of the Mustang's design and often quipped that the Americans had created a superb glider that simply lacked the appropriate motor. Rolls-Royce, having spent years perfecting the Leggery Merlin engine, possessed exactly what the Mustang lacked: a power plant equipped with a two-stage, two-speed intercooled supercharger designed to maintain optimal power output right up to 30,000 feet and beyond. It was a technological leap over the Allison system. The marriage was inevitable. In August 1942, acting on a suggestion from Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronald Harker, the British engineers fitted a powerful Merlin 61 engine into a captured Mustang airframe for an unauthorized but ultimately decisive experiment. The transformation was instantaneous and breathtaking. The new engine turned the sleek but altitude-handicapped airframe into a genuine high-performance dogfighter. The speed jumped dramatically, increasing by nearly 50 miles per hour, and crucially, the aircraft maintained that performance far into the stratosphere. At 30,000 feet, the Merlin-powered Mustang was flying faster than any German fighter in operational service. When the news reached the Americans, North American Aviation immediately began production of the new version, designated the P-51B and P-51C. This was not just an engine replacement. This was the birth of the leg, the true long-legged guardian the 8th Air Force had been praying for. Finally, the magnificent laminar flow wing had the appropriate heart, giving the fighter the operational range to fly from East Anglia, escort the heavies to Schweinfurt or Berlin, loiter above the targets, fight off the desperate deferrers, and bring the pilots home. Goering's defiant sneer about the range of Allied fighters was about to be obliterated by the swift silver shadow of the Merlin-powered Mustang. February 20th, 1944, 8:30 a.m. Over the North Sea, approaching the German Bight. This was the moment of strategic culmination. The operation, codenamed Argument and forever known simply as Big Week, began its coordinated assault against the Third Reich's aviation industry. The objective was singular and total: force the German Air Force into a decisive air battle. It could not win, eliminate the remaining fighter force, and thus secure the absolute air superiority deemed essential for the coming invasion of Europe. Big Week was an exercise in overwhelming, relentless pressure. Over 5 days, the combined weight of the U.S. 8th and 15th Air Forces, joined by RAF Bomber Command, targeted every major German manufacturing hub dedicated to fighter production: aircraft assembly plants, engine factories, component workshops, and associated ball-bearing facilities. Regensburg, Leipzig, Schweinfurt, Gotha, Braunschweig, and multiple targets near Berlin were hammered in successive, punishing waves. The architects of the plan understood that targets were secondary to attrition. They didn't just want to destroy factories, they wanted to destroy the men and machines defing those factories. The bomber streams became giant, flying bait, drawing out the beleaguered Jagdwaffe. The German High Command, understanding that the destruction of their production meant of their ability to fight, had no choice but to commit every available fighter, every reserve pilot, every desperate Zerstörer-Gruppe. This time, however, the heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force were not alone. Beneath the vapor trails of the B-17s and B-24s swarmed the X-ted wings of the P-51B and C models. They flew ahead, they circled above, and they remained on station long after previous fighter escorts had to turn back. They hunted the German interceptors not merely in defensive screens, but aggressively deep into enemy territory. For the Luftwaffe pilots scrambling from airfields near Brunswick and Oschersleben, the change was instantaneous and terrifying. In previous months, they had a safe sanctuary line once the American bombers passed the Rhine or the Ruhr. They knew they had maybe 20 minutes before the accompanying Allied fighters dropped their auxiliary tanks and peeled off toward England, leaving the heavies vulnerable for the rest of the journey. That sanctuary had vanished. Goering's boast, the one where he guaranteed the Reich the Allies would never see an enemy fighter over German skies, was reduced to a hollow, mocking echo by the silver contrails twisting high above the smokestacks of Gotha. The Reichsmarschall was reportedly furious, demanding to know how the Americans had achieved this impossible range. His subordinates, facing the reality he refused to acknowledge, could only confirm the grim reports coming in from the battlefront. The American P-51s were everywhere. They were fighting over the targets and chasing German aircraft down to the deck near air bases that should have been untouchable. In the initial 3 days of Big Week, the Luftwaffe sustained losses that were strategically catastrophic, not merely numerically significant. They lost over 350 operational fighters and, crucially, an even greater number of experienced pilots killed or captured. This represented the core of their remaining defensive force, the seasoned veterans who were irreplaceable in the rigid hierarchy of German aviation. The Allied fighter pilots, now flying the superior P-51, were not focused solely on protecting the bombers. They were focused on killing fighters. This was the essence of the mailing tube strategy. The bombers created the funnel, and the long-range escorts were the destruction waiting at the far American commanders explicitly instructed their fighter groups to prioritize engaging and destroying the Luftwaffe, even if it meant temporarily leaving the bomber box unprotected. The strategic shift was complete. Before Big Week, the question was whether the 8th Air Force could survive deep penetration missions. After Big Week, the question became whether the Luftwaffe could survive the Allied fighter sweeps. The attacks of Operation Argument successfully decapitated the German air defense structure. While German industry quickly recovered and dispersed production, the pilots lost during those 5 brutal days could not be replaced in time or quality. The skies over Western Europe were effectively sterilized in the weeks that followed. The Luftwaffe would rise again for desperate, localized battles, particularly against the ground invasion, but never again as a cohesive fighting force capable of stopping the relentless flow of Allied air power. By the spring of 1944, Allied fighter pilots were roaming virtually unchecked, conducting strafing missions against everything that moved, trains, trucks, and the hapless replacement aircraft ferried by inexperienced German teenagers. The Reichsmarschall's defiant promises about the sanctity of German airspace dissolved into the chaos of overwhelming aerial defeat, paving the way for the landings that would change the course of the war. March 4, 1944, over the approaches to Debrecen, Hungary, the promise of American air power, a promise Goering had so recklessly dismissed, was being fulfilled across 1,000 miles of hostile sky. This deep strike mission epitomized the newfound reach of the 8th Air Force, a reach made possible by the elegant aerodynamic efficiency of the North American P-51 Mustang. For months, the American doctrine had shifted from the simple hope of survival to the cold certainty of destruction, transforming the strategic air war from a costly gamble into an industrial grinder designed specifically to annihilate the Luftwaffe. The key to this transformation lay not just in the Merlin engine or the laminar flow wing, but in the external plumbing and the cheap disposable paper drop tanks. These seemingly minor technological additions provided the range that shattered the geographical sanctuary the Reich had previously enjoyed. Pilots who took off from East Anglia could now loiter over Berlin, Munich, or, as they were doing this day, the farthest reaches of occupied Eastern Europe, still holding enough fuel in reserve to engage, chase, and return home. This long durance fundamentally altered the calculus of aerial engagement. No longer were the bombers sailing alone for hours, frantically watching their escorts turn back at the midpoint penetration line, leaving them vulnerable to the concentrated attacks of the waiting German interceptors. Now, the Mustangs stayed. More critically, they were unleashed. American commanders recognized that merely protecting the bomber stream was insufficient. The war could only be won by destroying the enemy's fighter force, regardless of where they were found. This strategic imperative gave birth to the dedicated fighter sweep. Hundreds of Mustangs, sometimes without any bombers at all, would penetrate German airspace, their pilots instructed to aggressively seek battle. The mission was explicit: hunt down the Luftwaffe wherever they dared to operate. This meant attacking the critical infrastructure that kept the German Air Force flying. The pilots quickly learned the telltale signs: the smoke of test runs, the parked aircraft alongside hangars, the sudden rush of activity at an otherwise quiet field. Strafing missions became commonplace, turning quiet German airfields into infernos. Messerschmitt 1009s and Focke-Wulf 190s were destroyed on the ground faster than German factories, reeling from the bomber raids, could replace them. Repair depots were targeted, pilots in training were shot down over their practice fields, and vital fuel dumps that supplied the high-performance fighters were turned into massive pillars of oily black smoke. For the German deferrers, the appearance of the P-51s over their deepest territories was a shattering blow to morale. Previously, they could retreat deep into the Reich after engaging the short-range escorts, rearm, refuel, and wait for the Americans to come into range again on the next mission. Now, they had nowhere to hide. If a German pilot survived the initial combat, he often landed at an airfield only to find it under immediate attack by a roving flight of Mustangs operating 500 miles from base. The impact was systemic. German Fighter Command was forced to disperse its precious few remaining experienced squadrons across the vast area of the Reich, desperately trying to provide local defense against a threat that could materialize anywhere, at any time. This diffusion of resources meant that no single area could be effectively defended. The P-51s, roaming in packs of 4 or 8, often jumped entire squadrons of undertrained, fuel-starved German fighters who were simply trying to fly from point A to point B. The attrition rate became unsustainable. By the spring of 1944, the losses incurred by the Luftwaffe during these relentless fighter sweeps and escort missions exceeded their capacity to produce replacement aircraft and, far more critically, replacement pilots. These sweeps were not simply about winning individual dogfights. They were about achieving air superiority by dismantling the entire infrastructure that supported the enemy in the sky. Hermann Goering, who had promised eternal protection, now faced the grim reality of a war fought not just over his factories, but over his children's playgrounds, his forests, and his home. The Mustang proved that when air superiority is gained through attrition, the invasion that follows becomes a matter of timing, not risk. Every successful deep penetration strike made the coming landings in Normandy that much safer for the ground troops, as the German skies were systematically emptied of any meaningful resistance. This radical change in the strategic air war was perhaps nowhere more acutely felt than in the cockpits of the Jagdwaffe. For German fighter pilots, the appearance of the P-51 deep over the Reich was not merely a tactical setback, it was a profound psychological shock. Reports filed in early 1944 spoke less of combat performance and more of sheer disbelief. Squadron commanders struggled to understand how these highly maneuverable, deadly fighters could possibly appear over distant targets like Leipzig, Schweinfurt, or even Berlin, escorting the heavy bombers all the way home. The initial assumption from German intelligence had been that the Allied escorts would operate within a strictly defined combat radius, forcing the bombers to fly the most dangerous portion of their journey undefended. This was the core doctrine of German air defense: let the escort fighters run out of fuel, then smash the vulnerable bomber stream. The Mustang completely nullified this strategy. When Luftwaffe interceptors rose to challenge the B-17 formations, they found to their horror that the American fighters were waiting for them at high altitude, possessing not only the speed to match the best German aircraft, but also the loiter time to engage in prolonged dogfights. One recurring element in German pilot debriefings was confusion regarding the P-51's urines. How was it possible? German designers had focused on pure speed and climb rate, often sacrificing fuel capacity and armor. The German pilots simply could not comprehend the Allied innovation of the external drop tank, which turned the P-51 from a medium-range escort into a continental hunter. When German pilots would see these tanks jettisoned hundreds of miles from the front line, they realized the Allies were not just stretching their limits, they had entirely redefined them. The despair that followed was rooted in performance metrics. The highly successful German fighter, the Messerschmitt Bf-109, and the formidable Focke-Wulf Focke 190 were designed to be rapid interceptors. They excelled at quick, brutal passes against bombers. but when forced into sustained high-altitude maneuvering against the sleek, laminar flow wing of the Mustang, the German aircraft were found wanting. At altitudes above 25,000 feet, where the bombers flew, the P-51 maintained superior speed and turning radius. Luftwaffe pilots who attempted the traditional dive and zoom attack quickly learned that the P-51 could accelerate out of the dive or, worse, climb with them, keeping the fight alive until the German pilot ran critically low on fuel. The reports filtering back to the Reich Air Ministry were increasingly grim, detailing not only catastrophic losses, but a complete collapse of tactical initiative. Pilots who had survived the battles over the Reich now flew with a crushing awareness that they were no longer defying Germany, but merely delaying their own inevitable capture or death. A common lament among veteran squadron leaders was the feeling of being hunted rather than the hunter. Previously, they had chosen when and where to attack the bombers. Now, they knew that if they took off, a Mustang was likely already above them, waiting for the moment they engaged the bomber stream to swoop in for the kill. Even the introduction of specialized German aircraft, like the heavily armored Sturmbot versions of the Fu-190 designed specifically to absorb punishment while destroying bombers, proved ineffective. These powerful interceptors were too slow and heavy to evade the P-51. The Mustang pilots quickly learned to ignore the bombers and focus solely on eliminating the dangerous German interceptors, often shooting them down before they could even begin their attack run. By the spring of 1944, the reports ceased being tactical documents and became testament to the psychological disintegration of the Luftwaffe. The pilots understood what Goering still refused to acknowledge. Air superiority was not just contested, it was irrevocably lost. The skies above the Reich were now effectively Allied territory. And yet, the orders coming down from the top remained unrealistic, demanding aggressive sorties and impossible interception rates against superior numbers and, crucially, superior technology. This desperate disconnect between reality and command structure only served to hasten the emptying of the German skies, ensuring that by the time Allied landing craft approached the beaches of Normandy, the men defying the Third Reich would hear the constant roar of engines, knowing none of them were German. March 6, 1944, over Berlin, the disconnect between Hermann Goering's proud decrees and physical reality was violently terminated. For months, the high command of the Luftwaffe had clung to the belief that the sheer geographical scale of the Reich offered natural protection. American bombers could hit Western Germany. They could threaten the industrial centers of the Ruhr. But the capital itself remained too distant, too deep within the protective barrier of defying fighter commands to ever justify dedicated long-range escort. This calculation was the last great delusion of German air strategy. It was based on the performance limitations of previous Allied aircraft, not on the relentless trajectory of industrial innovation. As the B-17 Flying Fortresses approached the urban expanse of Berlin that morning, the German ground controllers noted the usual silver glints circling high above the bomber stream. But these glints did not turn back at the assumed limits of fighter range. They persisted. They grew larger. The new auxiliary fuel tanks, which Goering's intelligence dismissed as inefficient or prone to explosion, had delivered the fatal package directly to the front door of the Reich. The aircraft that finally broke the security of Berlin was the North American P-51 Mustang. It was fast. It flew higher than any contemporary German fighter, and critically, it was equipped to fight on equal terms with the most potent interceptors the Reich could muster, far from the protective coastal umbrella. To the terrified German deferrs scrambling to intercept what they assumed would be unescorted prey, the sight of the P-51s orbiting effortlessly high above the capital was a profound strategic shock, the aerial equivalent of seeing the enemy marching past Hitler's chancellery. The engagement that followed was not a contest of equals, it was an execution. German pilots, trained to dive quickly through the bomber formations and escape before the short-range escorts could react, were now met with the American fighters already in place, waiting, fueled, and armed. These Mustangs did not just protect the bombers, they hunted the deferrs. The long-range capability meant the Allies could dictate the terms of engagement over any German city they chose, ensuring that any German pilot who took off that day had to risk not just an operational loss, but total annihilation deep over enemy territory. The political damage to Goering was complete. His earlier infamous boast that if one Allied bomb ever fell on the Ruhr, they could call him Meyer had been mocked countless times by Allied radio. Now, the skies above his own headquarters, the heart of the Third Reich, were being openly patrolled by the enemy. The losses inflicted that day in March were not just numerical, they were qualitative. The Luftwaffe simply could not replace the veteran pilots, and flight leaders lost in the desperate defense of Berlin, while the factories producing replacement aircraft were simultaneously being battered by the very bombers these pilots had failed to stop. The strategic consequences were immediate and terrifyingly clear to the Germans. Previously, fighter squadrons were ordered to conserve fuel and avoid unnecessary combat, waiting for the perfect moment to strike the vulnerable bomber streams. Now, the Mustangs had created a no-win scenario. Ignore the fighters, and your industrial base is destroyed. Engage the fighters, and your irreplaceable cadre of pilots is lost. The inexorable arrival of the Mustang over Berlin signaled the of any coherent German strategy for air defense. From this point forward, the Luftwaffe was no longer a strategic weapon. It was a desperate reactionary shield, and one that was rapidly being chipped away. The Allies had achieved air superiority over occupied Europe in 1943. By March 1944, they achieved air dominance over Germany itself. The final, fatal assurance had been broken. There was nowhere left to hide. The men tasked with defending the Atlantic Wall now had to look up at the sky and see only American or British aircraft, knowing that the battle for the beaches was already half lost before the first landing craft touched the sand. March 6, 1944, approximately 1 p.m., at Carenhall, Hermann Goering's sprawling estate north of Berlin. The Reichsmarschall had spent years perfecting the art of bluster, dismissing British and American heavy bombers as merely slow, poorly defended targets fit only for target practice by his magnificent Luftwaffe. He had mocked the American idea of daylight precision bombing, insisting it was suicide without effective fighter cover. Cover, he believed, the Allies simply could not provide over the German heartland. Now, the sky was filled with the shuddering noise of thousands of engines, a sound that no longer brought excitement but a sickening dread. The raids had become relentless, and the targets were no longer just industrial centers on the periphery of the Reich, but Berlin itself. On this particular afternoon, the 8th Air Force delivered one of its most crippling attacks, singing nearly 800 B-17s and B-24s directly toward the capital. Goering watched from a heavily reinforced bunker near his private headquarters, relying on frantic reports from his overworked controllers. The initial reports were standard, German fighters engaging the massive bomber boxes, achieving local successes. But then the tone shifted. The intercepts began reporting fighters of exceptional range, capable of engaging the German interceptors not just momentarily but persistently, deep within the combat zone. These were not the earlier shorter-legged Thunderbolts or the P-38 Lightnings, which had to turn back long before the German capital. These were something new, something fast, and something devastatingly effective at altitude. The reports coalesced around a singular, horrifying detail: the shape of the wing, the radiator scoop, the unmistakable profile of the North American P-51 Mustang. Goering was eventually presented with photographic evidence captured by surveillance aircraft or downed pilots. It was the confirmation of total defeat. The sleek, streamlined, long-range fighter, powered by the superlative British Merlin engine, was not just appearing over the battle zone, it was dominating it. The Mustangs had turned the tables completely. They were flying ahead of the bomber streams, clearing the paths, circling above the combat box, and hunting down the German interceptors before they could even form up for an attack run. The promise Goering had made to Hitler, the boast that the Allies would never land a single bomb on the Ruhr, let alone Berlin, was a ruinous, forgotten joke. The Allied bombers were no longer alone, vulnerable sheep ready for the slaughter. They were escorted by wolves, and these wolves were hungry. The realization crystallized into a stinging public admission of his own failure and the crushing operational superiority of the enemy. When I saw the Mustangs over Berlin, he reportedly confessed to General Adolf Galland, Germany's leading fighter tactician, "I knew the war was lost." He understood instantly the strategic implication of that single, beautiful, terrifying aircraft. It meant that the American doctrine of massive, sustained daylight bombing, the very strategy he had ridiculed, was now tactically viable. It meant that the German fighter arm, the heart of the Luftwaffe, could no longer reach the bombers in safety. It meant the attrition against his pilots, against the best Germany had, would become unsustainable. The P-51 was, in Goering's bitter judgment, a punch in the stomach. It negated everything the Luftwaffe had built its defense strategy upon. It meant that every factory in Germany, every airbase, every marshalling yard, and every civilian center was now directly under the gun sights of the 8th and 15th Air Forces, with no practical hope of long-term defense. The fatal sight of the Mustangs seals the German fate in the air. The vast superiority enjoyed by the Allied air forces was now guaranteed not just over the coastlines or the occupied territories, but over the very seat of German power. The ability to project overwhelming air power, unchallengeable deep into the Reich, allowed the Allied planners to proceed with absolute confidence toward the inevitable ground invasion. Operation Overlord, the assault on Fortress Europe, could now be planned with the certainty that the German armies defending the shores would receive little or no support from the sky. The final assurance was definitively broken. The battle for France was already won above the clouds of Germany. July 17, 1944, high above the decimated oil refineries of Politz, the true cost of Goering's hubris became impossible to ignore. The great Reichsmarschall had mocked the American bombers, boasted of their fragility, and promised Adolf Hitler that not a single enemy aircraft would ever penetrate the skies of Germany. Yet, by midsummer, the air above the Ruhr, the heart of German industry, was a permanent highway for Allied four-engine giants. The tactical victory of the 8th Air Force in eliminating the veteran Luftwaffe fighter wing was swiftly converted into a strategic industrial catastrophe for the entire Wehrmacht. The crucial shift in Allied targeting from aircraft factories to fuel production proved the final mortal wound. Germany ran on synthetic oil, produced through complex chemical processes. There were only a handful of major plants. Operation Double Strike in June and July of 1944 hammered these installations relentlessly. Suddenly, the Luftwaffe could not fly, not because they lacked planes. Production actually increased marginally in 1944 thanks to the efforts of Albert Speer, but because they lacked the specialized high-octane aviation fuel necessary for combat. Training programs collapsed. The precious few hours needed to transform a novice pilot into a combat-ready flyer were slashed to desperate minimums. Pilots went into the cockpit with 20 hours of flight time when the Allies required 200. The result was inevitable slaughter. The Luftwaffe had been defeated not just in the air but in the logistics chain on the ground. Goering, increasingly reliant on morphine and trapped within his magnificent but meaningless estates, retreated into a cocoon of denial, surrounding himself with sycophants who reassured him of phantom victories. He obsessed over minor improvements to interceptor designs, promoting futuristic projects like jet fighters and rocket-powered interceptors, completely ignoring the fundamental constraint that fuel scarcity grounded the very machines he championed. The glorious Me-262 jet fighter, the Schwalbe, which could have potentially turned the tide had it been mass-produced earlier and employed correctly, became a symbol of this systemic failure. Its thirsty engines required vast quantities of the fuel that Germany simply no longer possessed. Moreover, the few jet pilots who did fly were quickly identified and hunted by the omnipresent Mustang squadrons, which operated under no comparable fuel restrictions. The strategic collapse of the air defense did more than just permit bombing. It crippled the Wehrmacht's ability to fight a mobile war. When the Allies broke out of the Normandy hedgerows, German panzer divisions, the very spear tip of the army, were frequently unable to move toward the front lines. They were subjected to ceaseless aerial attack while waiting for meager, often delayed fuel shipments. A division that was supposed to take 3 days to reach the battle often took 2 weeks, if it arrived at all. Tanks, the symbols of German offensive power, became static bunkers, burning on the roadside. Goering's defeat was absolute. Hitler, recognizing the Luftwaffe's utter failure to protect the homeland or support the army, increasingly marginalized the Reichsmarschall, the vast, self-important air force he had forged. Once the terror of Europe, was reduced to a shadow organization, fielding teenage pilots in underfueled aircraft against overwhelming odds. The strategic calculation made in 1943 by the Allied Bomber Command had been proven correct: break the Luftwaffe over Germany, and the entire German war effort must necessarily collapse. The skies were cleared, the oil reserves were dried up, and the German armies on both the eastern and western fronts were left deaf, blind, and immobile beneath the judgment of Allied air superiority. The war was definitively lost, not on the beaches of France or the steppes of Russia, but high over the smoking factories of the Third Reich.